Yeah, you can see these are bricks of the Great Synagogue. Each bricks are very typical of the period, which have the finger marks of the person who made them.
Oh wow!
So you get this very sort of tactile feeling of the person who made the bricks. So you put your fingers in those ridges. It's the first time somebody's put their fingers in the ridges for 3 centuries. It gives a sort of human feeling to it. Judogat or Yiddish gas, as it was in Yiddish, would have started around about where I'm standing and would have reached to around about here. Would have been the width of the street, and then would continue all the way from Stikliu Street on one side to Vokicu Street, German Street on the other side. So that's the lines changed completely.
I was born in the yard.
Oh, you were born in the yard? You went to school in the yard? You were born in the yard?
No, I was born the two
in the house on the other
two
side.
houses
Yeah.
here, which were built 1963.
That's right.
And this kindergarten was also built 1963. You have found the basement of the columns.
That's right, yeah.
2 of them.
We found 2 this year.
And the what is the size?
The width, they're about 1 meter, 1 meter 50 in diameter.
Oh.
That's big.
And
The bima. How deep? 2 meters below the ground.
2 meters?
2 meters down and another 7 meters up. Okay. Okay. This was the most important place in all Litvak Jews. And my family is Litvak on every side possible. So for us, this was the central focus of Litvak culture was this place. So working here is in a place that my grandfather would have seen, my grandmother as well, of course, would have seen is something that is a point of deep connection. So certainly working over here goes beyond the intellectual pursuit. It goes into also the personal connection to place. And that's something which is part of my identity, and of course every human's identity also involves the idea of place, the idea of something that they belong to. Especially for Jews, who are people who move around a lot, having something where you could say, well, this is where I come from, is something which is important. And so this is one of the places I come from. Among many other places, this is one of the places I come from.
L'histoire de ce documentaire commence en 2018. Nous sommes fin juillet et je suis déçu d'avoir manqué les 3 semaines de fouilles consacrées à la recherche de la grande synagogue de Vilna. Depuis 20 ans que j'habite à Vilnius, cette ville me fascine, notamment l'ancien quartier juif dont l'histoire remonte au XVe siècle. Or, en ce mois de juillet, le passé juif de la ville remonte à la surface sous laquelle il avait été enterré plus de 60 ans auparavant. Habitué des images de la ville en noir et blanc, le passé désormais se révèle en couleur grâce à ce carrelage sorti au milieu de nulle part. D'où provient-il ? Est-ce celui de la grande synagogue ? Sinon, de quel bâtiment recouvrait-il le sol ? Ainsi débute l'aventure de ce documentaire qui allait me conduire à Jérusalem et à New York. À Vilnius, je suivrai au quotidien la campagne de fouilles de 2019 qui se révélera exceptionnelle. Pour m'aider, une équipe d'animateurs 3D, d'architectes, d'illustrateurs travaillera à partir de photographies d'époque et des dernières découvertes archéologiques à recréer visuellement ce monde disparu. Beaucoup de personnes m'apporteront leur aide. Cependant, je n'aurais jamais pu me lancer seul dans cette aventure sans l'aide des archéologues John Seligman et Richard Freund et de l'historien Vladimir Levin. Étant français, résidant à Vilnius, je ne pouvais pas commencer ce documentaire sans évoquer l'écrivain français Romain Gary, né à Vilnius en 1914. Romain Gary est le seul écrivain à avoir reçu 2 fois le prix Goncourt, le plus célèbre prix littéraire en France. Dans son roman autobiographique, La promesse de l'aube, il raconte son enfance à Vilnius, au numéro 16 de la rue Grande Poulanka. Vilnius, à l'époque, était polonaise. Dans cette cour habitait M. Piekielny. M. Piekielny était convaincu que le jeune Roman deviendrait, comme le prétendait avec aplomb sa mère, ambassadeur de France et grand écrivain. Un jour, seul avec l'enfant, M. Piekielny fait alors promettre au futur ambassadeur de mentionner à toutes les personnes importantes qu'il rencontrerait plus tard dans sa vie qu'à Vilna avait vécu M. Piekielny.
Пообещай мне, что скажешь им, что на 16-м доме Wielkiej Pogulańki в Вильну жил пан Piekielny.
À mon tour de faire une promesse, celle de rappeler qu'au numéro 6 de la rue des Juifs à Vilna se trouvait la grande synagogue.
There were actually 2 legends how Vilna got this nickname, Jerusalem of Lithuania. The more famous legend is, of course, that Napoleon came, he looked at the synagogue and he said, there are different versions, you know, this is the Jerusalem of Lithuania, or I like the one where he's looking on the streets, and believe me, Napoleon had never seen so many Jews before because there weren't so many Jews in Paris in the early 19th century. So he is shocked that there are so many Jews, and that's when he turns to his generals and says, Messieurs, nous sommes à Jérusalem. That's the more well-known legend, but I actually like the Jewish legend, which seems to be older, which is in the 17th century, Vilna was becoming an important Jewish community, but was not yet that important in the 1600s. And there was a council of Jewish communities in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, called in Hebrew Vad Medinat Rita. But it was not democratic. Not every Jewish community sat on this council. Only the most important communities had representatives on this council of Lithuanian Jewish communities. So far, everything I'm telling you is historically true. And the next thing is also true. Vilna applied to become a member of the Council of Lithuanian Jewish Communities in the 1600s. Now the legend begins. The legend is that the other older and larger communities rejected them. We don't want Vilna. It's a new place. It's a relatively new community. It's not large. It's not distinguished. And these other communities, which were places like, today they're mainly in Belarus, Grodno and Brest-Litovsk and Pinsk, said we don't want them. And then Vilna sent a letter to respond to this rejection, in which they said, but we have 333 Jews here that know the entire Talmud by heart. Now the Talmud is thousands of pages long. To know the entire Talmud by heart is very difficult. And when the members of the council got this letter of 333 Jews in one city, and not a very big one, know the Talmud by heart, they were shocked and they were stunned. And one of the leaders of the council, a rabbi, stood up and said, we must accept Vilna into the council. It is the Jerusalem of Lithuania.
À Vilnius, les fouilles ont commencé depuis plusieurs jours. Un matin, je reçois un message énigmatique de John avec pour objet « Allons enfants de la patrie ». Une photographie d'une pièce de monnaie est jointe au message. À regarder de plus près, je m'aperçois qu'il s'agit en fait d'un bouton. C'est un bouton d'un uniforme d'artilleur de la Grande Armée. Quand Napoléon arrive à Vilnius en 1812, Vilnius rayonne déjà dans le monde juif de l'époque. Ce rayonnement est dû en grande partie au Gaon de Vilna, décédé à peine 13 ans auparavant et dont on reparlera par la suite. La présence des Juifs en Lituanie remonte au XIVe siècle, à l'invitation du grand-duc de Lituanie, Gediminas, également fondateur de Vilnius. Le grand-duché de Lituanie s'étendait au XVe siècle de la mer Baltique à la mer Noire. On estime dans le grand-duché 120 000 Juifs en 1569, puis 250 000 au début du XIXe siècle. Ces communautés sont alors réparties en shtetl, bourgs, petites villes ou quartiers, comme à Vilnius. Bien qu'en grande partie détruit dans les années 1950, le quartier juif est toujours présent, avec ses rues typiques, ses arches. La vie de la communauté juive y était très dynamique. Quelques inscriptions en yiddish nous le rappellent. Au début de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, la communauté juive de Vilnius représentait près de 40% de la population de la ville. Vilnius est aujourd'hui la capitale de la Lituanie. La vieille ville est inscrite au patrimoine de l'UNESCO depuis 1994. Vilnius est célèbre pour ses églises baroques. Nous sommes dans le nord-est de l'Europe et pourtant, nous avons l'impression d'être parfois en Italie. Le style du baroque de Vilnius est considéré comme le dernier éclair du baroque en Europe. Mais Vilnius abritait avant-guerre également près de 160 synagogues, dont beaucoup étaient en fait des maisons de prière que l'on appelle Kloisen en yiddish. Ces Kloisen étaient fondées par des personnes privées, des communautés religieuses, des guildes de marchands. Seuls 2 bâtiments étaient considérés alors comme des synagogues. La synagogue chorale, qui existe toujours, ainsi que la grande synagogue, la plus grande, la plus importante de la communauté juive, celle qui sera détruite par les soviétiques dans les années 1950, et sur laquelle on bâtira une école primaire.
Very many towns and cities had one principal synagogue. This is more true of bigger towns and cities, where there's one great synagogue used for the top cantors, the top rabbis, where you have the highest prestige, and where you also have a social basis for Jewish leadership. Interesting, in Yiddish there are several words. In Vilna, the Great Synagogue was called in everyday Yiddish the Stadt Shul, the city synagogue, the one for the whole city, not for just one street. Or it was called the Great Shul, the large synagogue, the Great Synagogue.
The first synagogue is of wood. We don't have any information about it at all. Historically, architecturally, other than we know that a building stood at the site in the 15th century. I don't know what it looked like. We have a number of cases where the building is attacked and burnt. In the 17th century, we have permission to build a stone structure. The Lithuanian world, we're not talking stone, we're talking usually a brick structure. And we're talking about a Renaissance Baroque building which is built at the site with permission from the authorities, which is the basis of the building which stands there today, or doesn't stand there today, stood there until the Second World War. So we're talking about, or later than the Second World War, to the 1950s. And that building was a square building, which is a Baroque building in style. It's a square building. The building itself is very likely not to have been designed by a Jewish architect. There is no difference in the architecture which the building shows to the building of other Baroque buildings that were built at the same time during the 16th and 17th century in Vilnius, because Vilnius goes at that time from a city of wooden structures to a city of brick and stucco structures within a century. And the churches which are built around it are no different in that aspect to the synagogue itself. If we're looking for a architectural parallel, we should probably look at the German Lutheran church, which is just across the street. On the other side of Vokietu Gat, where you have The German church, that church, I think, is built at around about exactly the same time, and it wouldn't surprise me to find out that it was built by the same architect, though we don't have the direct information. Various elements of that building are very, very similar in style. The windows, the ceiling decoration, the vaulting is all very, very similar in style to what we also have from the pictures of the Great Synagogue when it was standing until the 1950s. That's the cultural architectural milieu. So that's what it looked like. At the very first stage, the building was a square structure, only the central part of the synagogue itself, and that's how it stood. It's what we call a 9-volt plan. In other words, it's 9 equally sized cross vaults forming a square. And in the central square, you have the bima, usually held up by columns which go right from the floor to the ceiling. The unusual aspect of the Vilna synagogue is that it's, because of its size, the bima is then enclosed within those pillars rather than the pillars being part of the bima itself. But that's the kind of structure, and falls into a large group of other synagogues of the same type and of the same period.
What usually what people could see was the gable decorated with 2 colonnades, 2 rows of columns, and according to its architectural style, this gable was probably made in the beginning of the 19th century, and we can see it's a kind of dialogue with the Cathedral of Vilnius, which was built in the late 18th century, also in classicist style, with very prominent portico with huge columns. So the gable of the Great Synagogue with its columns always says, I am a cathedral for the Vilna Jews.
The street was a narrow pathway between the one building and the next building, and the next building is the Great Synagogue. And the Great Synagogue had steps, which you can see right in front of my feet, which went through this area and then down into the synagogue. Now, the big surprise, of course, for anybody visiting the Great Synagogue, was that you went down into the Great Synagogue.
But there was an ecclesiastical rule that said you can't build any higher than the local church. So the Jews of Vilnius decided instead of building up, they would build down. And that was crucial. They built the Great Synagogue of Vilnius 2 floors below the street level.
You must remember that for most religious buildings, you go up to the religious building, and that's part of the experience of going from the street level up into the structure. Here you went down into the structure, into the building, into the Great Synagogue, and the reason you did that was because the Great Synagogue's floor was 2 meters below street level.
So in World War I, when the Germans occupied Vilna, there was a newspaper that was published for the people in the German army, and it was supposed to be about day-to-day life in Vilna, that they would have an appreciation for what it was. And one of the correspondents decided that he wanted to see the Great Synagogue and what the Great Synagogue of the Jews looked like. And he describes how he was told to go on a Friday afternoon before the Sabbath, and he essentially went to the Old Jewish Quarter. He went to the Old Jewish Quarter, and he started following the throngs of people. And he kept following the people and looking and trying to figure out where is the Great Synagogue. He figured as he would, more and more people started joining the crowds, he would eventually be able to see the Great Synagogue. But he kept looking around and he was unable to identify any great buildings, any buildings that like you would have with the church that towers over and that you would immediately be able to see. And then he talks about how he finally reached the building, but he's surprised that this would be the Great Synagogue. Again, it's nothing that has the height or the grandeur, certainly from an external perspective. And then he describes how he descends the stairs, and as he descends the stairs and goes through the door, immediately the Great Synagogue opens up to him. And he now sees truly what the Great Synagogue with its columns and pillars, and he talks about how he understands how this could be the temple of the Jews, this could be the great temple, the Beis HaMikdash, and it just evoked this feeling of awe that the architecture and the people, and again, you have this beautiful setup of the Great Synagogue where you have the center bima that had the columns, and then the aron, the ark that was flanked similarly by columns and went up a series of stairs. But again, the size as well as just the grandeur of the synagogue, he was blown away by. He really was just so impressed. And it was this very unique experience where it was from nothing, almost from this very humble exterior, still to be able to, when you get to the interior and you realize, as with so many things in life, that the external doesn't necessarily represent the internal. And he was just able to see that and experience that.
Pour la première fois, je me rends à Jérusalem, à l'invitation de mon ami Richard Freund, qui me fait découvrir la ville. C'est à cette occasion que je rencontrerai pour la première fois John Seligman et Vladimir Levin. Dans cette ville mythique, j'oublie un instant que je suis venu pour mon documentaire et je me rappelle que je suis avant tout photographe. C'est alors, au Musée national d'Israël, que je reprends le fil de mon documentaire devant la maquette de Jérusalem et du second temple de Salomon.
A synagogue is a Jewish house of prayer. In Jewish history, the synagogue became a central concept after the destruction of the great temple in Jerusalem for the second time in the year 70 AD at the hands of the Romans. The rabbis who created rabbinic Judaism to enable this people, this religion, this group to survive around the world without being a political entity, without having sovereignty or an army or a navy, they found a passage in the Hebrew Bible, Mikdash Me'at, a little bit of a temple. Maybe not the great temple, but a small temple, something to replace the temple. There was another factor involved. With the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple came an end to the ancient practice of animal sacrifices. Instead of animal sacrifices, the rabbis introduced prayers, very often with the same names and the same times as the earlier sacrifices. Today, Jews pray Shachris in the morning, Mincha in the afternoon, Ma'ariv in the evening. These and others go back to the times of ancient sacrifices that since 70 AD or so are prayer times in established synagogues. The word synagogue from Greek was never a very homey, warm word for Jews themselves. It is a word from outside. Modern Jews in most countries call it a shul. We go to shul on Shabbos.
According to the Jewish law, the synagogue is definitely not the temple. So the Jerusalem temple, situated in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount behind me, where the golden dome of the rock is situated now, was the only place where Jews were allowed to perform sacrifices. The synagogues, on the other hand, is called in Jewish sources little sanctuary. So it is kind of representative of the temple in the places where Jews live all over the globe, in diaspora or in Galut. But it's, so synagogues, especially great synagogues, will include many reminiscences of the temple, which sends you back to Jerusalem. You are in diaspora, but your heart is in Jerusalem, and it reminds you about Jerusalem.
For most Jewish people, their klois, their bismedrish, their prayer house, their study house had to be warm and welcoming. It had to have entertaining talks on the Torah and on the Talmud and on the legends. It did not have to be architecturally beautiful with many flourishes. So that is a difference between the synagogue tradition and the church tradition in Europe and in Eastern Europe. Where the Jews were interested in architecture was usually in many cities, not towns, only in a so-called Great Synagogue. To have something that's architecturally impressive was of interest to a small number of elites in the community who indeed wanted their stature and the stature of their prayer house to be imposing, to perhaps correspond to imaginations about the temple thousands of years ago in Jerusalem with big columns and thousands of people. If you talk about Vilna, the architecture of the Great Synagogue was of course spoken about and famous for hundreds of years. But if we turn to any of the other 160 synagogues, there were 160 between the two world wars, it's difficult to find others where the architecture plays a major role. The second one where it plays a role is the Karl Synagogue, built around 1902, 1903 for the so-called modernists within Orthodoxy on Zavalna Street, today's Pilimo, the one that still survives. That too had an architecture that obviously was important to the builders and the worshippers. They were the tiny circle of wealthier modernists who had maybe at the back of their minds the idea that Judaism can compete in some architectural, artistic way with other religions. But again, it was mostly for rich people. That's the truth. We don't like to admit it today. But the Karl Synagogue was not for everyday Jews. Everyday Jews wanted somewhere with warmth and with wonderful words emanating from the different speakers. There was not only the Rov, the rabbi, there was the Magid, who was a specialist in telling stories and entertaining in an entertaining, happy way, sometimes to make people laugh and cry. In other words were what determined the success of a prayer house and not architecture.
Well, first of all, I never expected in my entire life that I would ever do any work in Lithuania or Poland. 5 years ago, a colleague, John Seligman, came to me at a conference and said, let's do a project together. Now, John Seligman, who is from the Israel Antiquities Authority, is one of the leading experts in the world on Byzantine monasteries. So I thought he was coming to me to talk about doing a project up with Byzantine monasteries. I have spent most of my life working on Roman period excavations in Nazareth and Bethsaida and Yavne and Qumran. And so I thought he was talking about something in the Roman period or the Byzantine period. And he said, no, I want to do the Great Synagogue of Vilna. And I was shocked. I was shocked. Why would you want to do that? You're a great Byzantine archaeologist. And what he said made a tremendous impact upon me. He said, my family came from Vilna. Your family came from Vilna. We should find out what happened in Vilna. And let's do it by trying to find the Great Synagogue of Vilna.
We decided to do geophysical work together with our American and later Canadian associates, with Professor Freund and with Harry Joel and Paul Baumann and others. And that work dealt with the trying to identify the different parts of the site using geophysical methods.
In the case of finding the Great Synagogue, non-invasive archaeology was crucial, because what we were able to do was to prove that the Great Synagogue was there underneath the elementary school and in the playground without having to disturb the elementary school and the playground. We could excavate only those areas that yielded artifacts, and then we knew what we needed to excavate.
So what we're seeing here is subsurface imaging. We're using ground penetrating radar to image into the subsurface, and what we're doing is, as we run these lines here, we're collecting a grid, and we process that grid so we can look at features into the subsurface, potential buildings, walls, and things like that.
You could say, and as I've been told by various historians, well, why are you doing excavation? We have pictures, we have architectural plans. Isn't it a waste of time to do the excavation? We know what the building looked like, and that's true. We did know what the building looked like in a general sense. But archaeology has the kind of methodological tools that can gives us information which goes beyond the historical documentation.
So in the case of the Great Synagogue, we must excavate everything. What we have is a building that is like a time capsule. And doing archaeology at the Great Synagogue is one of the ways to preserve what happened not only 70 years ago, not even 100 years ago, but 300 years ago, when the Great Synagogue became the Great Synagogue. And the Great Synagogue is a great place to excavate, because when the Great Synagogue was destroyed, all of the elements from the Great Synagogue fell down into this big heap of the 2 floors below, and then the Soviets, who came to destroy what was left of the remnants of the Great Synagogue, they capped it with a cement block and then built the elementary school on top, inadvertently, ironically, preserving the Great Synagogue for all time.
En juillet 2018, la nouvelle fait sensation. Une partie de la bima a été mise à jour juste sous le bureau de la directrice de l'école.
Okay, we're now looking down into the bima. We looked on the other side of the bima. This is the back side of the bima.
On voit bien sur ces images les blocs de béton ayant servi de fondation à la construction de l'école.
So anyhow, as you can see the floor of the Great Synagogue and the back of the bima, and that continues through to the other side. Just under where you're standing is one of the columns. I'll have to excavate that in future years. Another column is in the next room. Maybe we'll do that next year.
When I worked, for example, on a synagogue in China, the synagogue of Kaifeng in China looked like every other Chinese institution, resembling a pagoda in terms of its construction. But the thing that brought every single synagogue together is the bima. It's the altar, the high place, where they would direct their attention during the Torah reading.
In East European synagogues, prayer houses, study houses, the bima is separate. It is in the middle and not part of the platform where the ark is. Okay, there are different terms, al-memer, bima, and then there's the reader's stand or the stender, but the bima in the middle is where the shliach tzibur, or shatz, for Jews love abbreviations, the shatz is the cantor. The word is shatz and not cantor because cantor, chazan, implies a good voice, a musical talent, but the person who leads the prayer in weekdays needn't necessarily be a cantor who can do cantorial tricks with his voice. And so you have the reader, the shatz, the one who prays on behalf of everybody to God, who is supposed to be himself a very pious man who takes it very seriously. And so that's at the reader's desk, and the Torah is brought to the reader's desk.
That bima is the connecting point for every single one of the synagogues in antiquity all the way up to the modern period.
Une partie de la bima ayant été découverte sous les fondations de l'école, les jeunes lycéens volontaires de la ville de Thilloy creusent de l'autre côté du mur afin de mettre à jour la partie principale de la bima. La tâche risque d'être longue. De mon côté, j'en profite pour rejoindre mon amie Rita Glassman, qui arrive de San Francisco et qui est à la recherche, dans les rues de Vilnius, du magasin que possédait sa famille avant-guerre. La rue est facile à trouver, elle porte le même nom que Rita, la rue des Verriers.
Number 10, Stikliu Street.
Son père a eu la chance de s'échapper du ghetto avec une partie de sa famille et de s'installer après-guerre aux États-Unis.
As you can see, here it is. Oh my God. I know this song. On the bus, trying to make his way home. Trying to make his way home. Can you believe it?
Rita est cantor, c'est-à-dire qu'elle chante les textes liturgiques hébraïques lors des moments de prière à la synagogue. Bien entendu, à l'époque de la grande synagogue de Vilna, cette fonction n'était réservée qu'aux hommes. Pourtant, elle est d'une certaine manière la prolongation de la mémoire des cantors de la grande synagogue de Vilna. Née à New York, lorsqu'elle était petite, son père l'emmenait tous les samedis matins au temple Bethel à Brooklyn. La synagogue se trouvait très loin de la maison, pourtant, son père l'y emmenait chaque samedi. Il l'emmenait pour une raison. Écoutez le fameux cantor Moshe Koussevitzky, qui fut de 1924 à 1927 le cantor principal de la grande synagogue de Vilna. C'est le frère aîné de Moshe, Dovid, qui sera par la suite l'un des premiers professeurs de chant de Rita. Ainsi, avec Rita, se prolonge jusqu'à aujourd'hui le fil invisible des cantors de la grande synagogue de Vilna.
So I have to say, finding in the excavations of the Great Synagogue, the original bima of the Great Synagogue was one of the great discoveries that I've ever been involved with.
That's the floor of the Great Synagogue. I'm standing on the bima. This is the floor of the bima, and the bima had two main parts. But the most important thing to notice, first of all, is this column. This is the famous column, one of the 4 columns of the Great Synagogue. This is one column, and this is another column here. It's been completely damaged by this heating system which was put here for the school. It is so huge that I didn't, until I actually saw it, I didn't realize how big. I mean, I know how big it is. I've seen the plans, but you can't. There's somehow a difference between what you see on a plan and the reality. And I was shocked by the size of it, so much that we actually planned the square too small, because we actually thought we were going to be on the other side of the bima, and we're not. We have to go another 2 meters in that direction to finish the work over there. The bima had 2 parts. So you had, in between the 2 columns, you had the main bima structure, which was a square area. It had 4 columns over here, which supported a large Tuscan columns, painted, we probably think, green, not marble, no marble. It's Lithuania. It's all brick with plaster. And then in the front side, this would be the internal part of the bima, which goes under the school today, and we excavated last year in the room behind us. Okay, here we come to the front part of the thing. We come to the front part of the bima. The front part of the bima, and we have this is the area of the chazan, of the cantor, and he would stand exactly where the red point here, like this. This is the point where the chazan would stand. Then you would have a balustrade, a banister, a fence, and in this part it was the table of the chazan. And here he would read the Torah to the people, and the Aron Kodesh would be where those trees are over there. That's the geography of the place. The floor is a 19th century addition. We had no knowledge of this floor at all. It's completely new to us. There's not a single picture of the floor. The floor is terrazzo in black and in red. It's 19th century and has a number of patterns on it. That's what we have in this particular part of the site. Underneath we have a cellar, which is a big surprise. It's not a typical feature of the bima at all. We don't know of this having cellars underneath the bima. It's a surprise. But what was great was that because the building was destroyed, it was a place where everything could fall down and be hidden away. So this was full of all sorts of interesting things, many coins, seating plaques, and the most important find was an inscription in Hebrew, which was in pieces, part of it inside and part of it also on top, which we found over here in this particular part of the site.
It's a big stone. Be careful. Slowly, slowly. Oh la la. Hallelujah. Tveria, Jerusalem, John! John!
I'm coming. What have you found?
John, תסתכל, אגדה.
Wow, that's fantastic. An inscription in Hebrew with gold lettering. I can see the name of the city of Tiberias, the city of Jerusalem. That's extraordinary, really fantastic. Where's the other piece?
We continue to work.
Okay, that's amazing. This is a fantastic find from the excavation. We have over here an inscription from the cellar that's below the bima. So this is fallen down when the building was destroyed, fallen down below the bima. We have fantastic inscription with the letters with gold lettering. It must be from the facade of the bima, from some position we don't yet know. And the wording in Hebrew is saying that we arose with great joy to our country. In other words, we went to the Holy Land with great joy. And it talks about the story of somebody who has gone or a group of people actually, who have gone to the cities of Tiberias and to Jerusalem, we have information about Jews from the area of Vilna who went in the 18th century especially to the Holy Land. So if we can find some connection between this inscription and that story, this would be extraordinary and fantastic.
It says you can, that's it! That's a continuation!
Right here.
Here it is!
Okay.
Atotokum Tzilachin Tzion. That must be very heavy.
Exactly.
אוקיי, רק שנייה, זה הכל מתחבר עכשיו. וואי, 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 וואי. In the front of me we have a magnificent inscription which we found while we were doing the excavation here on the bima of the synagogue. This particular inscription talks about the aliyah, the immigration of a man from Vilna whose name was Chaim. He settled in Tiberias in the Holy Land and afterwards passed away in the city of Jerusalem in 1796. This particular stone was donated by his sons and is really one of the very first finds we found which show us so much about the life of the Great Synagogue during its 300 years of existence.
Les fouilles de 2019 sont terminées. Celles de 2020 n'auront malheureusement pas lieu. En attendant 2021, les archéologues continuent d'analyser leurs découvertes, dont on parlera dans la deuxième partie de ce documentaire. On reviendra aussi sur les inscriptions mises à jour par John et son équipe. Maintenant que nous avons rendu vivante la grande synagogue dans notre mémoire collective, nous aborderons dans la deuxième partie de ce documentaire son rôle et sa place dans le monde juif multicolore de Vilnius de l'époque. Bien entendu, nous parlerons de la destruction de la grande synagogue. Cependant, je n'ai toujours pas répondu à ma question concernant le carrelage posé au début de ce documentaire. Le carrelage était-il celui de la synagogue? En fait, non. Le carrelage était celui des bains publics, dont le bâtiment se situait juste à côté de la grande synagogue, dans la même cour. Ainsi, il faut préciser que la grande synagogue se trouvait au centre d'un complexe organisé autour de 2 cours, comprenant 12 lieux de prière et d'études, des toilettes publiques, un puits, des étals de viande, ainsi que la fameuse bibliothèque Strachun. Ce complexe s'appelait Shuloif et était le cœur du quartier juif de Vilnius. On y venait pour prier, étudier, lire, se purifier, boire ou pour toute autre activité du quotidien. Pour comprendre la synagogue de Vilna, il faut donc comprendre le Shuloif, dont elle était inséparable. Rendez-vous donc l'année prochaine pour la suite de ce documentaire consacré à la grande synagogue de Vilna et au Shulof. À bientôt.
One of the least understood figures in Litvak and Vilna Jewish history is perhaps its most famous figure. That's a paradox. The Gaon of Vilna, der Vilner Gaon, Reb Elio Bereb Shlomo Zalman. Now, in order to understand the Gaon of Vilna's greatness, one has to do something very difficult. One has to make a mental exercise, to do a thought experiment where we tell ourselves everything he was not. He was not a communal leader who leads his people. He was not somebody that people came to Vilna to visit. He was not someone who fought for tolerance or who was any kind of political leader in wanting rights for the Jews. He was none of those things. What was the Gaon of Vilna? He was a genius in understanding and explaining difficult passages of the Talmud and the Kabbalah that had not been understood for hundreds of years, or in some cases thousands of years. So there are classic examples, which we can prepare for another day, where great Polish rabbis, a century before the Gaon, in Krakow or in Lublin, they had a method, a fun method called pilpul, where they would make up some nice story to explain this sentence. Nobody fooling themselves that it explains what it originally meant, but giving some explanation. The Gaon said, no, we must understand the actual text. So his main contribution was figuring out the real meaning of a completely inscrutable, incomprehensible passage in Talmud or Kabbalah. And he did so by methods that maybe are not that unusual today. He was the first to employ what we call in modern literary studies textual analysis. Now, according to the Jewish religion, the Torah, the 5 books that have to be written in the scroll by that very great learned Sofer, has no mistakes. It has, the way we have it is the Torah. There is no such tradition about the rest of the Bible, about the Mishnah, about the Gemara, about the Talmud, about the Kabbalah. So the Gaon of Vilna compared manuscripts. He compared similar passages in different manuscripts and different printed books, and he very often came to the conclusion, there's a typo, there's a mistake in this sentence, it's not clear. Now, in order to be able to do that, he had to have a phenomenal memory. We in the 21st century don't value this because we have the internet and computers, and we can quickly look up how many times a word and where it occurs in the Talmud and in what form, and so on. But in the 18th century, this power of memory of the Babylonian Talmud, and you have up there the Jerusalem Talmud, the other Talmud that was much less studied. So you had a phenomenal mind of Talmudic understanding, of fixing of faulty manuscripts, understanding of difficult texts, and teaching the truth of what these Talmudic authors meant when they wrote it. So to the modern mind, big deal. Today a computer could do it, maybe. But to the classic Jewish mind, this was the highest form of Torah scholarship, understanding the Talmud and the Kabbalah and being able to explain them, to correct them, and to establish the correct text for future generations. That's point 1. Point 2, once he was recognized as so great on point 1, that gave him authority to be a poisek, or we Litvaks say pesek, that means a decider, someone higher than a rabbi who has the right to adjudicate a legalistic question, sometimes going against a rabbi from 100 years earlier. It's a legalistic literature. It's jurisprudence. When people start studying Talmud, they think they're going to find pages and pages about God and religion and the angels, and then they find pages and pages of, if a brick falls out of my window and injures someone, it fell out by accident, what percentage am I guilty? What percentage is somebody who didn't see it coming and should have been looking? It's all about law. Not all, but a lot of it is law that's not even applicable, the laws of building the temple and running the temple in Jerusalem. Now, to continue about the Gaon of Vilna. The Gaon of Vilna understood, for example, that the Talmudic tractate about the laws of the 7th year, where the Bible says the land must be allowed to rest the 7th year, not be cultivated, Shemitah, that without going out into the fields and learning from some peasant, something about planting and sowing and reaping, you're not going to understand what they're talking about. So that is where the Gaon said, whoever wants to study this tractate, this speciality of the Talmud, the laws of the seventh year, yes, Shvius or Shemitah, has to become an expert in agriculture. And that gave people the idea that he was a modernist who said you should study other things. More famously in astronomy. There's entire sections of the Talmud, and indeed Kabbalah, and indeed astrology, that have to do with the sun and the moon and the stars and the movements and the dates and how to calculate the Hebrew lunar calendar. It's not a real lunar calendar. It's fixed every few years by a leap year in order that Passover should still be in the spring, that the Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, should still... The Muslim lunar calendar is a real lunar calendar, yes? Ramadan can occur in any season. So anyway, this very complicated Jewish calendar, the Gaon said, you got to study astronomy if you're going to deal with it. Okay, so among his other projects, he apparently translated a work into Hebrew. It's not the original work about the basis of astronomy. And because of this grew the legend that he was a great astronomer or that he was a great agriculturer. He also, on the laws of rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, for a religious person, the coming of the Messiah and the resurrection of the dead are every bit as real as this table and the sun and the moon. And so for him to study all these details of the Talmudic instructions for rebuilding the temple, one had to study geometry, one had to study some architecture, one had to study these things. So the Gaon brought a higher level of intellectual rigor to Talmudic studies. It was less and less of rabbis sitting around trying to be clever, and more logically based study of the ancient text to understand what they meant. On the topic of religion, the Gaon was extraordinarily strict. The fact that he supported the study of astronomy, geometry, and the trigonometry, etc., had to do with Talmudic study, not because he was agreeing with the Haskalah, the modern Jews of Germany, that Jews had to stop studying Talmud and replace this study with modern studies. He hated that view, but he coincided when, for example, it is said he gave a blessing to his pupils to publish books on astronomy, published by one of his pupils in Germany after being a student of the Gaon, and claiming that the Gaon told him that it's important and necessary to do. So that's another way in which he was important. So we've mentioned so far, the main thing is his intellectual ability and memory with understanding the text of the Talmud and Kabbalah. Second, the authority to pass judgment on Jewish law based on the first. Third, his understanding of the need for certain modern studies in order to accomplish the foregoing. Those were three things of the Gaon of Vilna. The Gaon of Vilna during his lifetime wrote only one thing, I'll call it a thing, essay, that's not this obscurantist Hebrew, Aramaic, Talmudic, Kabbalistic notes that he writes 3 words and it takes a great Talmudist today to know what the heck he's saying. This is the letter he wrote to his family, to his wife and children, it's now called Igeres HaGro, the missive, the letter of the Gro. The story that he tells there is that he had planned to leave his family and move to the Holy Land to fulfill the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. Something happened, we don't know what, and he didn't make it and he returned. But before he returned, he had written this document telling his family how to live. Okay, so many modern people, everybody should read it. It's translated into many languages, for sure English and I'll give you a few of the statements from this book, and I think people might be shocked. If you can pray at home, it's much better, and avoid the synagogue. If you go to the synagogue, you'll be overcome with perhaps jealousy of other people, who dress better or are more clever, have a better voice, whatever. You may become sexually attracted to someone that minute and not be thinking of the prayers. You may do something that's the worst thing of all. You will get involved in gossip about somebody. And then he goes through similar things. If you can educate your children at home, if you have the money to educate them at home, much better to educate them at home than to have them running around the school and getting the worst as well as the best from other people. So the Gaon of Vilna became known as a recluse, as a hermit, that in his little apartment in Yiddish Gas, in the Jewish quarter, near the Shul, nobody could get near him. In fact, the only picture we have of the Goyen that was drawn during his lifetime was drawn by a Catholic Polish student at what is now Vilnius University, who was fascinated. Who is this great rabbi that Jews come from all around the world to see, and they don't get to see him because he has no time to waste? Okay. So according to this story, this student waited in the backyard where every human being has to go out to the facilities that were outside. And we have this drawing. I'll show you a copy inside. It's completely, I believe it's authentic and very different from all the fake drawings from the 19th century and 20th that are based on a German Jewish rabbi with fancy hat and fancy things. He has nothing but the prayer shawl over his head. So the lore of the Gaon, the folklore, became the folklore of the Litvak, that the Litvak is learned, the Litvak is honest, but the Litvak is not very sociable. The Litvak wants to work his whole life and study and considers it a waste of time to have fun with people. So there's all kinds of stories. One of the most famous is, and it may be apocryphal, but it doesn't matter, it goes to the image of the Vilna Goyim. He had a sister who lived somewhere far, and he hadn't seen her for dozens of years. And when she was old and ill, she came to see him for the last time. And he wrote her a beautiful letter explaining that he can't take time off the study of Torah, of the holy books, and they will have plenty of time to meet and speak in the world to come. That is a true story, whether it's historical or not, because that is the Vilna Goyim. To sit alone. He didn't make a yeshiva in his life. He didn't make an academy. In his later years, he had around his table around 7 students. Okay, so the Gaon developed this obsession with study and knowledge that in the modern period was, of course, sometimes reinterpreted to science or to math or to history or to poetry or to some other concern. But it's the certain fanaticism of don't waste time with social things. When he was older and he needed to sleep more, he fought this intention by forcing himself to stay up and to study with his feet in cold water. Again, we don't know if some of these stories are exaggerated, but they explain accurately the man.